The year was 1881, and the silence in Arthur Blackwood's house had a weight to it, heavy as a headstone. It had settled in the corners of the rooms 3 years prior, on the day he had buried his wife, Eleanor, and their stillborn son beside her on the low hill overlooking the creek. Since then, the silence had become his only constant companion, a presence more real than the phantom aches in his bones after a long day's work. His ranch, carved out of the vast, unforgiving Montana territory, was a testament to a life he had once planned with vigor. Now, it was just a set of chores, a mechanical rhythm that pulled him from his bed before dawn and sent him back to it after dusk, too exhausted for dreams. Arthur was a man hollowed out by loss. The laughter that had once filled the small cabin was a ghost in his memory, and the scent of Eleanor's baking was a phantom that sometimes ambushed him when the wind was just right. He moved through his days with a grim efficiency, mending fences that seemed to break of their own accord, tending to cattle that were little more than walking currency, and chopping wood as if he could splinter his grief with every swing of the axe. The land itself was an echo of his inner world, vast, lonely, and prone to sudden, brutal shifts in temper. The sky was an endless expanse of blue that offered no comfort, only a reminder of his own smallness, his own insignificance in the face of an uncaring God. He rarely went to the dusty settlement of Promise, a town named for a hope he no longer possessed. When he did, his transactions were brief, his words clipped. The townsfolk watched him with a mixture of pity and unease. They saw a capable man, broad-shouldered and weathered, but his eyes held a permanent distance, a look of someone staring at a horizon no one else could see. They whispered about his solitude, about how no man was meant to live so alone. Some said he was courting madness. Others simply shook their heads and said the prairie had claimed another soul. Arthur heard none of it, or if he did, he paid it no mind. His world had shrunk to the boundaries of his property line, to the rigid routine that kept him from completely falling apart. Then, one afternoon in late summer, a disruption came riding over the grassy plains. He saw the dust cloud first, a smudge against the horizon that slowly resolved into 3 riders. It was not the direction from which visitors usually came. A knot of apprehension tightened in his gut. Strangers often meant trouble. He retrieved the Winchester from its pegs above the door, its familiar weight a cold comfort in his hands, and waited on the porch. The men who reined in their horses before his cabin were not soldiers or lawmen. They were hard-faced trappers, men whose lives were written in the leathery texture of their skin and the feral watchfulness in their eyes. The man in the lead, a hulking figure with a tangled beard and a cruel twist to his mouth, was named Vance. Arthur knew him by reputation, a man who dealt in whatever was profitable, be it furs or human misery. With them, tethered by a rope to the lead man's saddle horn, were 2 young women. They were Cheyenne, their faces stoic masks of terror and resignation. One looked to be on the cusp of womanhood, perhaps 16 or 17, her gaze defiant and sharp as flint. The other was younger, smaller, her eyes wide and fixed on the dusty ground, as if refusing to see the world that had ensnared her. They stood huddled together, a small, fragile island of shared humanity in a sea of callousness. "Blackwood," Vance grunted, his voice like gravel. "Heard you were living like a ghost out here. A man needs a woman. Or 2. He grinned, a flash of yellowed teeth. "A gift, from some folks who owed me a debt. They'll keep your bed warm and your house clean. Strong stock." Arthur's hand tightened on the rifle. The world tilted, the quiet, grieving order of his life shattering into 1,000 sharp pieces. He looked from Vance's leering face to the 2 girls. He saw not strong stock or a solution to his loneliness, but 2 terrified children, stolen and sold like livestock. The older one met his gaze, and for a fleeting second he saw not defiance, but a desperate plea for an end to this nightmare, one way or another. In that moment, something deep inside him, a part of him he thought had died with Eleanor, stirred with a protective fire. "I don't buy people, Vance," Arthur said, his voice low and cold, the first words he had spoken with any real feeling in years. Vance shrugged, unconcerned. "Ain't buying. It's a gift. What you do with 'em is your business. But I can't take 'em back." He untied the rope and let it fall to the ground. The gesture was one of finality. He and his men turned their horses, their business concluded. "Consider it a kindness," Vance called over his shoulder, the words a bitter mockery that hung in the air long after they had ridden away. Arthur was left standing on his porch, the Winchester growing heavy in his hands, the silence of his ranch now broken by the soft, fearful breathing of two strangers. The sun beat down, and the world held its breath. His solitude had been breached, not by comfort, but by a moral crisis that stood shivering in the dust before him. For a long time nobody moved. Arthur remained on the porch, a sentinel guarding a home that was no longer his alone. The two sisters stood by the water trough, their shoulders touching, their silence a wall against him, against the world. The older one, Vivina, kept her chin high, her dark eyes tracking his every move with a wariness that bordered on hate. The younger one, Mesa, seemed to be trying to make herself invisible, her small frame curled inward. The situation was impossible. He couldn't keep them under the pretense Vance had established. The thought was a violation of Eleanor's memory and every decent instinct he had left. But he couldn't turn them out either. To send them walking into the prairie would be to condemn them to starvation, or worse, to falling into the hands of men like Vance again. He was trapped, and so were they. Finally, the sun beginning its slow descent and painting the sky in bruised colors of orange and purple, Arthur lowered the rifle and leaned it against the cabin wall. He took a slow step off the porch, his hands held open and away from his body to show he was unarmed. The girls flinched, a single, unified movement of fear. I won't harm you," he said, the words feeling clumsy and inadequate in his mouth. He doubted they understood him. He pointed a finger toward the cabin door, then made a motion of eating. "Food." He pointed to the water pump. "Water." Vivina's eyes narrowed. She whispered something to her sister in their own tongue, a cascade of soft, urgent sounds. Misa only pressed closer to her. Arthur waited, his patience a thin, fraying thread. He was a man accustomed to the simple logic of animals and seasons, not the terrifying complexities of this human wreckage. He sighed, a sound of profound weariness, and turned to walk back into the cabin. He left the door open, an invitation he did not expect them to accept. Inside, the space felt different, charged with their presence outside. He moved to the stove, his actions deliberate and slow. He stirred the embers, added wood, and put a pot of the stew he'd made the day before on to heat. The smell of beef and root vegetables, usually a lonely comfort, now felt like an offering, a desperate prayer. He ate his own portion, standing by the counter, his back mostly to the door. He listened. For a long time there was nothing but the whisper of the wind, then a faint, scuffling sound. He didn't turn. He heard the creak of the floorboard just inside the threshold. He finished his meal, washed his bowl in the basin, and set 2 more bowls on the small, rough-hewn table. He filled them with stew and placed a spoon beside each. Then, without looking at them, he walked to the small spare room at the back of the cabin, the one that had been intended as a nursery. He opened the door. It was empty save for a simple cot and a wooden chest. He gestured towards it from the hallway. "You can sleep here," he said, his voice quiet. He backed away, retreating to his own room and closing the door, leaving them to the main room of the cabin, to the food, to the semblance of shelter. He lay on his bed, fully clothed, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of his own house. He heard whispers, the scrape of a spoon against a bowl, the soft pad of feet. He did not sleep. He was a jailer. He was a protector. He was a man utterly and completely lost. The first days unfolded in a fragile, unspoken truce. Arthur rose at his usual hour, the sky still a soft grey, and found the 2 bowls washed and neatly stacked on the drying rack. The sisters were already awake, huddled in the corner furthest from his room, their blankets drawn around them like armor. He would nod to them a curt, awkward gesture and go about his chores. He tried to give them space, to make his large presence seem smaller. He worked on the far side of the property when he could, his absence a kind of courtesy, yet he was always aware of them. He would see them from a distance, two figures moving cautiously around the cabin, exploring their prison. Vivina was the shadow, always watching, always positioned between him and her younger sister. Mesa was more tentative, her curiosity sometimes winning out over her fear. He saw her once reach out a hesitant hand to touch one of the hardy prairie roses Eleanor had planted, a splash of defiant color against the drab brown of the yard. The sight caused a sharp, unexpected pang in his chest. Communication remained a chasm between them. He learned to speak with actions. He would leave a bucket of fresh water on the porch. He would place a stack of firewood near the door. One afternoon, he returned from hunting with 2 rabbits, and after skinning them, he left one on a clean cloth near the cabin, a silent offering. When he came back later, it was gone. It was a language of necessity, of survival, and it was the only one they shared. One evening, a storm rolled in, the sky turning a malevolent green-black. The wind howled like a thing grieving, and rain lashed against the cabin in furious sheets. Arthur was securing the shutters when a crack of lightning split the sky, followed by a deafening roar of thunder. From inside the cabin, he heard a small cry. He pushed the door open to find Mesa weeping, her face buried in Vivina's shoulder, her body trembling uncontrollably. Vivina held her tight, murmuring to her in their language, but her own face was pale and taut with fear. In that moment, they weren't foreign, they weren't a problem, they were just 2 terrified girls, a long way from home. Arthur's heart, a muscle he thought had atrophied from disuse, clenched. He remembered Eleanor, how she'd hated the storms. He remembered holding her, telling her they were safe, that the house was strong. He crossed the room and lit the lantern, its steady golden glow pushing back against the raging darkness. He didn't say anything. He simply sat in his chair by the cold stove, a silent, solid presence in the room, until the worst of the storm passed. He was not comforting them, not really. But he was there. And for the first time, when Vivina looked at him across the flickering light, the raw hatred in her eyes was tempered with something else, a flicker of weary, reluctant acknowledgement. A shift began, subtle as the changing of a season. The fear in the girl's eyes started to recede, replaced by a cautious curiosity. They began to venture further from the cabin, exploring the creek bed, their movements becoming less like those of caged animals and more like those of young people exploring a new, strange territory. Arthur found himself watching them. He saw Vivina's innate strength, the way she moved with a natural grace and awareness. He saw Mesa's quiet gentleness, the way she would collect smooth stones from the creek or watch the hawks circle high overhead. He started to see them not as a unit, a pair, but as 2 distinct individuals. One morning he found Mesa in the small garden patch beside the cabin, her fingers tracing the dying leaves of Eleanor's rose bush. He walked over, his boots crunching on the dry soil. She flinched but didn't run. "It needs water," he said, his voice softer than he intended. He went to the pump and filled a bucket, then brought it over. He didn't hand it to her, but set it down between them. He pointed to the roots. "Here." Mesa watched him for a long moment. Then slowly she knelt. She dipped her hands into the bucket and began to carefully pour water around the base of the plant. Arthur stood by, a silent guardian. It was the first task they had ever shared, a small, fragile bridge built across a chasm of silence and mistrust. He began to teach them things, not with words but by example. He showed Vivina how to track, how to read the signs left by deer and rabbits. He took her to the ridge where he practiced with the Winchester, and after ensuring it was unloaded, he showed her how it worked, the bolt, the sight, the trigger. He wasn't teaching a wife to help. He was teaching a survivor to defend herself. She was a quick study, her focus intense, her hands steady. He showed Mesa the ways of the ranch that required a gentler touch. He let her help with the chickens, her initial fear giving way to delight as she collected the warm eggs. He showed her which herbs growing wild by the creek were good for tea and which could soothe a wound. He found he was speaking more, simple words at first. "Good," he would say, when Vivina hit the tin can he'd set up on a fence post. "Careful," he'd murmur as Mesa reached for a plant with thorns. In return, they began to share parts of their world with him. He would hear them singing sometimes, a soft, melancholy tune that drifted on the evening air. One day he came back to the cabin to find a small, intricate pattern woven from dried grasses sitting on the table, a gift from Mesa. Another time, Vivina, seeing him struggle to mend a torn leather strap, took it from him, and using a small awl from her bundle of possessions, stitched it with a neatness and strength he couldn't replicate. One night, the grief ambushed him with particular ferocity. He woke from a nightmare, the ghostly cry of his son echoing in the silent room. He sat up, his chest tight, the loss of physical weight pressing down on him. He stumbled out into the main room, needing air, needing to escape the confines of his memory. He didn't realize he had made any sound until he saw Vivina standing in the doorway of her room, watching him, her expression unreadable in the moonlight streaming through the window. He turned away, ashamed of his weakness, and went to the chest where he kept Eleanor's things. He lifted the lid and pulled out a small, worn wooden bird she had carved. He held it in his palm, his thumb tracing its smooth contours. He didn't have to look to know Vivina was still there. He didn't try to hide it. For the first time, he let the wall of his stoicism crack, letting his sorrow be seen. He didn't weep, but a profound sadness radiated from him, a coldness that had nothing to do with the night air. When he finally looked up, Vivina had not moved. Her gaze was no longer hostile or wary. It was knowing. She had seen his wound. She gave a slow, almost imperceptible nod, a gesture of understanding that transcended language, and retreated back into her room. The exchange was brief, silent, but it changed everything. He was not just a white man, a captor. He was a man who had also lost everything, and they were not just Cheyenne girls, stolen and afraid. They were people who understood the shape of grief. It was a few weeks later, during a quiet evening meal, that the decision solidified in his mind, not as a thought, but as a certainty, a truth that settled into the very marrow of his bones. He watched them eat, Vivina now meeting his eyes without flinching, Mesa occasionally offering a small, shy smile. They were bringing life back into the dead spaces of his home, of his heart. They were not wives. They could never be. They were something else entirely. He cleared his throat, the sound loud in the quiet room. They both looked at him, their spoons pausing mid-air. "In this house," he began, his voice rough with disuse and emotion. He looked at Vivina, then at Mesa. "You are daughters." He stumbled over the word, a foreign concept on his tongue. "My daughters." He tapped his chest. "Father." He pointed to them. "Daughters." They stared at him, their brows furrowed in concentration. He didn't know if they understood the specific words, but they understood the tone. They understood the final, complete absence of threat, the profound shift in the very air between them. There was no lust in his eyes, no expectation of servitude. There was only a raw, clumsy, and fiercely protective tenderness. Mesa looked at her sister, a question in her eyes. Vivina held his gaze for a long time, searching his face. She saw the truth of his words there, stark and undeniable. Slowly, a tension she had carried in her shoulders for months seemed to dissolve. She gave another one of her slow, deliberate nods. The pact was sealed. Not with a contract or a ceremony, but with a quiet look of acceptance in a lonely cabin under the vast Montana sky. Arthur Blackwood was no longer just a widower. He was a father, and they were home. The peace that settled over the ranch was a fragile, hard-won thing. The silence was different now, no longer heavy with grief, but filled with a comfortable companionship. The routine of the ranch became a shared rhythm. Vivina, with her sharp eyes and steady hand, became his partner in the more demanding work, riding with him to check the cattle herds, her presence beside him a quiet statement of belonging. Mesa transformed the small cabin, bringing touches of beauty and order. She tended to her garden with a fierce devotion, coaxing not just Eleanor's roses, but also squash and beans from the stubborn soil. The scent of cooking herbs often filled the air, a fragrance of life reclaiming a place that had been consecrated to death. Arthur found himself changing. The deep furrows of sorrow on his brow began to soften. A rare, rusty smile would sometimes touch his lips when Mesa presented him with a perfectly baked potato, or when Vivina outsmarted him in tracking a deer. He was teaching them English, pointing to objects and saying their names. Fence, horse, sky. They, in turn, taught him words in Cheyenne, their voices soft as they corrected his clumsy pronunciation. The house was no longer a tomb. It was a school, a workshop, a home. But the world beyond their small sanctuary had not forgotten them. One blistering afternoon, Arthur saw the familiar dust cloud on the horizon again. His blood ran cold. It was Vance, and he had 2 of his men with him. Arthur sent the girls inside, his voice low and urgent. "Stay away from the windows." Vivina grabbed the Winchester from its pegs without hesitation, her face a grim mask of resolve. Mesa hurried to bolt the back door, her earlier fear replaced by a steely determination. They were a unit, a family bracing for an attack. Arthur met Vance on the porch, his own rifle held loosely at his side. He had changed since their last meeting. He was no longer a man drifting in a sea of sorrow. He was anchored by a purpose he would die for. "Blackwood," Vance sneered, his eyes flicking over Arthur's shoulder toward the cabin door. "Came to see how you're enjoying the gift. Heard some strange talk in town. Folks say you're treating 'em like pets, not wives. That's an insult to my generosity." "They're not your gift to give," Arthur said, his voice level and dangerous. "And they're not my wives, they're my daughters. This is their home. You're not welcome here. Leave." Vance let out a bark of incredulous laughter. "Daughters? You gone soft in the head, old man. They're savages. Property. I came to collect what's mine. You clearly don't know what to do with them." He swung down from his horse, his men following suit, their intentions clear. They meant to walk right into his house and take the girls. "You take one more step," Arthur said, raising the rifle to his shoulder, the motion fluid and certain, "and I will end you." Vance's smile faltered. He had seen Arthur as a broken man, an easy mark. He now saw a man made of iron, his eyes burning with a cold fire. But Vance was not a man who backed down easily. "There's 3 of us, Blackwood. Only one of you." "You're wrong," a clear voice said. From the darkened window beside the door, the barrel of the second Winchester appeared, held steady in Vivina's hands. Her aim was fixed directly on the chest of the man to Vance's right. "There are 3 of us too," she said, her English precise and cold. Vance froze. His men exchanged nervous glances. This was not the scenario they had envisioned. They had come for 2 frightened, helpless girls, not a fortified position defended by a determined man, and a girl who looked like she knew exactly how to use the rifle she was holding. The standoff stretched, thick and heavy as summer heat. The only sound was the buzz of flies and the stamping of a nervous horse. Arthur's focus never wavered from Vance. Vivina's never wavered from her target. They were a wall. Suddenly, from the side of the cabin, a flurry of movement. Mesa, using a distraction they must have planned, threw a bucket of soapy water directly into the face of the 3rd man. He sputtered and cursed, momentarily blinded, his hand flying to his eyes instead of his gun. It was the only opening they needed. Arthur didn't fire to kill. He fired a single shot into the dust at Vance's feet, the explosion deafening in the still air. Vance jumped back with a yelp, his bravado finally shattering. His men, one half-blinded and the other staring down the barrel of Vivina's rifle, were already backing away toward their horses. "Get out," Arthur commanded, his voice ringing with an authority that could not be defied. "And if you ever ride onto my land again, I won't aim for the ground." Vance stared, his face a mask of fury and humiliation. He saw the truth in Arthur's eyes. He saw the fierce protectiveness in Vivina's. He saw the small, brave figure of Mesa standing by the corner of the house. He had lost. He spat on the ground, scrambled onto his horse, and galloped away without a backward glance, his men trailing behind him like beaten dogs. Arthur watched them until they were nothing more than a disappearing speck of dust. He lowered his rifle, his shoulders slumping with the release of tension. The door opened, and Vivina stepped out, followed by Mesa. The three of them stood on the porch, the lingering smell of gunpowder in the air. The threat was gone. They had faced the ugliness of the world together, and they had won. Arthur turned and looked at the two young women standing beside him. Vivina met his gaze, and for the first time, a true, brilliant smile lit up her face. Mesa rushed forward and, in a gesture of pure, unthinking love, threw her arms around his waist and hugged him tightly. Hesitantly, Arthur rested a hand on her head, then reached his other arm out, drawing Vivina into the embrace. The three of them stood there, a strange and wonderful constellation on the lonely frontier, a broken man who had found a reason to heal, and two lost girls who had found a father. The house behind them was no longer just a structure of wood and nails. It was a home, forged in sorrow, tested by fire, and now, finally, filled with love. In the seasons that followed, the ranch on the high plains became a world unto itself, a sanctuary of quiet joy. The specter of Vance and his ilk faded into a bad memory, and the town of promise, with its judgmental eyes, became irrelevant. Arthur's world, once shrunken by grief, had expanded to encompass the vibrant lives of his daughters. The rhythms of their life together were gentle and sure. Mornings were for work, the three of them moving with a practiced harmony that needed few words. Afternoons were for learning, with Arthur teaching them to read and write English from an old, tattered Bible, and they, in turn, sharing the stories and legends of the Cheyenne, painting pictures with their words of a world he had never known. Vivina's artistry with leatherwork became a source of pride, her intricate designs adorning saddles and pouches. Mesa's garden flourished, a riot of color and life that seemed to defy the harshness of the land. The profound silence of grief was replaced by the sounds of a family. The murmur of conversation, the melody of a Cheyenne song sung by Mesa as she worked, the sound of Vivina's soft laughter, a rare and precious thing that always made Arthur's heart feel a little less scarred. He found himself laughing, too, a rusty, unfamiliar sound at first, but one that grew more frequent and natural with each passing day. One evening, as the sun set, casting long golden shadows across the valley, Arthur sat on the porch, watching them. Vivina was patiently showing Mesa how to fletch an arrow, their heads bent close together in concentration. They were no longer the terrified, haunted children who had been left in his dust. They were strong, resilient young women, filled with a grace and spirit that humbled him. He thought of Eleanor, not with the sharp, stabbing pain of before, but with a gentle, melancholy warmth. He believed she would have loved them. He believed she would have understood. He had not replaced her, or the son they lost. No one ever could. But the love he felt for these two girls was a different branch of the same tree, a new growth reaching for the sun from a trunk that had been brutally severed. Mesa looked up and saw him watching. She smiled, a radiant expression of pure contentment, and called out to him, "Father, come see, the arrow is straight." The word "father" still struck him with a sense of wonder each time he heard it. It was a title he never thought he would hold, a sacred responsibility he had been given by the cruelest of chances. He stood up and walked over to them, his heart full. He was no longer Arthur Blackwood, the grieving widower living like a ghost. He was a father. And in the vast, lonely expanse of the American West, in a small cabin built on loss, he had found his family. He had found his home.